Ilara Harlow was the girl no one really knew, and Victor Harlow was the father everyone quietly feared. But behind the locked doors of their home, they shared a secret so twisted it would lead to a brutal murder, a vanished drifter, and a small town forever scarred by the truth. In the secluded town of Hawthorne Hill, nestled between forgotten hills and endless farmland, lived a man named Victor Harlow. He was known to most as a quiet, solitary figure, a skilled electrician who fixed things for a living but kept to himself after sunset. Victor had lost his wife Lillian in a tragic car accident nearly 2 decades ago. Since then, he had raised their only child, Ilara, entirely on his own. Most residents pitied him for having to be both father and mother, but no one dared to get too close. Victor never invited people in. His home sat on the edge of town, surrounded by thick trees and high wooden fences that made the property feel more like a fortress than a family residence. Ilara Harlow was born with striking beauty. Pale skin, raven black hair, and eyes that held 1,000 untold stories. As she grew older, she became even more captivating, but also more withdrawn. Victor had chosen to homeschool her from the start, claiming public schools weren't safe or suitable for someone like her. That explanation was enough for most in the town, who had long accepted Victor's eccentricities. Occasionally, Ilara would be seen walking quietly through the grocery aisles beside her father or sitting silently in the passenger seat of his rusted pickup truck. She never smiled, never spoke to anyone, just followed Victor like a shadow. Whispers occasionally passed between neighbors about how odd their relationship seemed. Some noticed how Victor's hand lingered on her shoulder just a moment too long, or how Ilara flinched when strangers spoke to her. But these observations stayed in hushed tones, never reaching beyond gossip. In a town like Hawthorne Hill, secrets were easy to keep, especially when everyone preferred not to get involved. Victor's house, hidden behind tall hedges and thick curtains, was a world unto itself. Inside, he had created a reality where only he and Ilara existed. From childhood, Ilara was taught that the outside world was dangerous and full of people who wouldn't understand them. She was told that love was different for everyone, that their connection was unique, sacred, and unbreakable. Over time, those words blurred the lines in Ilara's mind. She had never been given the chance to question what was happening. She had no friends, no internet, no phone. Just books selected by Victor, chores assigned by Victor, and days spent under his watchful eyes. As Ilara entered adulthood, something inside her began to shift. She no longer accepted everything at face value. Her thoughts grew heavier, her mind more restless. She started hiding things, tiny scraps of paper where she scribbled her feelings, old photographs she managed to save from the trash, broken trinkets she found during her rare moments alone. These were small acts of rebellion, but to her, they were everything. Victor noticed the change. He became more possessive, more vigilant. He accused her of being ungrateful, of letting the world poison her mind. The punishments grew harsher, long. Periods of confinement, denial of food, emotional manipulation masked as discipline. Ilara learned to smile when he was near, to obey without question, but in the silence of the night, she would lie awake, staring at the cracks in the ceiling, wondering what life could be like beyond those walls. Outside the Harlow house, the seasons changed. Children grew up, neighbors moved away, and the town remained as sleepy as ever. But within those walls, a storm was gathering. Ilara was no longer the compliant girl Victor had shaped. Her thoughts were no longer his to control, and deep inside, buried beneath layers of fear and trauma, was something fierce, a resolve that one day she would be free. That something would have to break. And when it did, no one in Hawthorne Hill would ever forget the name Ilara Harlow. The summer that Callum Rhodes arrived in Hawthorne Hill was unusually hot. The crops were struggling, the air was thick with dust, and the town seemed to move slower under the weight of the heat. Callum was a quiet drifter in his late 20s. lean and sunburned from weeks of walking along back roads. He carried only a worn backpack, a sleeping bag, and the kind of weariness that came from having no place to belong. He had no family, no destination, and no plans beyond the next job or warm meal. When he came across a notice outside the feed store offering temporary farm work, he decided to stay a while. A local farmer, Mr. Delaney, agreed to give him work tending the fields and allowed him to sleep in an old tool shed on the edge of his land. It was modest, but gave Callum some shelter from the sun and a view of the surrounding area, including, just beyond the trees, the Harlow property. The house sat like a dark shape behind the brush, its windows hidden behind thick curtains, its lawn overgrown, and its driveway covered in fallen leaves. Something about it felt frozen in time. Callum wasn't the type to pry, but he noticed patterns. Most days, the man of the house, Victor, as he later learned, left early and returned just before dusk. And nearly every evening, just as the sky turned orange, the girl would appear at the edge of the woods. She always walked alone, slowly, with her head down. She never ventured far, never looked around, never stayed long. Her movements were mechanical, as if she were following invisible instructions. But what caught Callum's attention most were the bruises. Faint, but unmistakable. Dark marks on her wrists, a shadow under her jaw. He'd seen enough hardship to know the signs. One afternoon, Callum saw her trip and fall near a thicket of bushes. She didn't cry out. She simply stood back up, brushed herself off, and disappeared into the trees. That night, he couldn't sleep. Something about her haunted him. The way her shoulders stayed hunched, the way her eyes never met the world. He started leaving food and water near the edge of the woods, hoping she'd find it. And she did. The next morning, the items were gone. He did it again the following day, and again they disappeared. There was no message left behind, no signal of thanks, but he felt something unspoken pass between them. Soon after, Callum stumbled across a piece of paper wedged beneath a rock near the trail she often walked. It was damp and crumpled, the handwriting shaky and uneven. The words were few but chilling. "He won't let me go. I'm not allowed to speak. I don't know what love means anymore." There was no name, but he knew exactly who had written it. Callum took the note straight to Sheriff Marla Kearns. She was a seasoned officer, pragmatic and calm, and had served Hawthorne Hill for over a decade. She knew the Harlow name, knew Victor was a man of few words, but also knew nothing had ever been reported about him officially. Still, something about Callum's tone and the note itself stirred a sense of unease. Sheriff Kearns began her own quiet surveillance. She drove past the Harlow house in unmarked vehicles, watched Alara's walks from a distance, and made notes about Victor's routine. The more she observed, the more the pieces didn't fit. There were no visitors, no signs of a normal life inside. Only silence, darkness, isolation. Victor, however, had started to sense that someone was watching. He became more erratic, peering through curtains at odd hours, inspecting the woods with a flashlight at night. He stopped letting Alara leave the house altogether. Her short walks came to an end, and the property seemed to close in like a trap. What Victor didn't know was that Alara had already left pieces of herself outside. Notes, fragments, clues. And someone had begun to put the story together. But time was running out. Something was unraveling behind the walls of that house, something that neither Callum nor Sheriff Kearns fully understood. And it wouldn't be long before the darkness at the heart of the Harlow home spilled into the open. The morning the sheriff arrived at the Harlow residence, a heavy fog clung to the ground like a warning. Two unmarked vehicles rolled down the gravel driveway, their tires crunching slowly over fallen branches. Sheriff Marla Kearns had obtained a search warrant from the county judge just hours earlier. The note Callum had found, combined with her observations, had finally provided enough to legally intervene. Still, She wasn't sure what she was walking into. Her gut told her the truth would be worse than anything written on paper. Victor Harlow opened the door with a look of false calm. His eyes, cold and sharp, scanned the officers behind the sheriff. He asked if something was wrong, pretending to be surprised, but the tension in his body betrayed him. When Marla handed over the warrant, Victor hesitated before stepping aside. He knew he couldn't stop them, but he hovered close, watching their every move with tightly clenched fists. The inside of the house was eerily quiet. The curtains were drawn, and the air was heavy with a strange, stale odor. Every corner of the home felt frozen in time. Old furniture, dusty shelves, faded photographs, and an unsettling sense that nothing had changed in years. The sheriff and her team began their search with measured steps, opening cabinets, checking rooms, taking photos. But what concerned them most was the absence of Ilara. She wasn't in her bedroom, nor in the small attic where it seemed she had once kept. A few personal items, mostly books and hand-sewn crafts. There was no phone, no computer, no traces of a social life. It was as though she had lived like a ghost. Sheriff Kearns asked Victor where his daughter was. He claimed she had gone to visit a friend, but he couldn't name who. He said she was an adult and could go where she pleased, yet every word he spoke sounded rehearsed. Then they found the basement door. It was sealed with 2 deadbolts and a padlock. Victor immediately grew agitated. He demanded to know what right they had to enter that space, insisting it was storage and nothing to see. But the search warrant gave them access, and when the locks were forced open, what lay beyond the door changed everything. The basement was dimly lit by a single overhead bulb that flickered when they pulled the chain. The concrete walls were stained and cracked. Against one wall were metal shackles bolted into place. A dirty mattress lay in the corner, its fabric torn and stained with something dark. There were photographs nailed to the walls, dozens of them. Most featured Ilara at different ages, some innocent, others deeply unsettling. One officer found a locked drawer containing VHS tapes and handwritten notes that hinted at years of grooming and psychological torment. Victor was arrested on the spot, but the question remained: where was Ilara? A search began that extended across the woods, nearby barns, and every stretch of land within a mile of the Harlow property. Local volunteers, canine units, and even drones were brought in. Hours passed without progress. The daylight began to fade, and just when hope started to dwindle, a park ranger spotted movement near a stream deep in the woods. A barefoot figure stood silently in the water, her dress soaked and clinging to her frame. It was Ilara. She was clutching a blood-stained kitchen knife, her hair wild, her eyes distant. She didn't speak, didn't move, didn't respond to her name. Her arms were covered in scratches, her lips trembling. As officers carefully approached, she surrendered the knife without resistance. At first, they thought the blood belonged to Victor. But when they tested it, the results stunned everyone. It wasn't his blood. It belonged to Callum Rhodes. Confusion and fear rippled through the investigation. Callum had gone missing just the day before. He hadn't shown up for work, hadn't returned to the tool shed, and wasn't answering his phone. Now, Ilara was found alone in the woods with his blood on her hands and no explanation as to why. The case had taken a violent, unexpected turn. Victor was a monster, that much was clear. But the young woman everyone believed to be his helpless victim had now become the focus of a much darker mystery. Ilara Harlow sat in a white-walled observation room, her hands wrapped in bandages, her eyes locked on a distant point no one else could see. Days had passed since she was found in the stream, and still she had not spoken a single word. Her silence became a second mystery layered atop the first. A court-appointed psychiatrist, Dr. Evelyn March, was brought in to assess her condition. What she found disturbed her deeply. Ilara displayed signs of long-term trauma, dissociation, and intense psychological conditioning. She was not simply silent. She was disconnected, as if her mind were trying to protect itself from something too dark to confront. Meanwhile, the investigation into Callum Rhodes's disappearance escalated. Blood matching his DNA had been found on Ilara's clothes and beneath her fingernails. But there was still no body. Forensics teams combed the woods, the riverbanks, and the property. Dogs picked up trails that led to nothing. Officers drained a section of the nearby creek. Nothing emerged. Every possibility was explored: murder, self-defense, accident. But without a body or a confession, the case hung in a space of unbearable uncertainty. Victor Harlow was charged with multiple counts of child abuse, unlawful imprisonment, and possession of explicit material involving a minor. In his first court appearance, he appeared unfazed, even smug. He claimed Ilara had been protected, loved, and educated better than most children. He called himself a father, misunderstood by a broken society. But the evidence was overwhelming. The basement alone told a story no words could excuse. Victor's trial loomed. Ilara remained confined under psychiatric evaluation, officially not yet charged, but also not free. The knife she had been found holding had Callum's blood on it, yet no defensive wounds or injuries were found on Ilara herself. This detail baffled investigators. If there had been a struggle, there was no physical proof of it on her body. And if Callum had harmed her, there was no record, no evidence of his intent to do so. Only that single, haunting note she had written weeks earlier. Then, a break came from an unlikely source. A USB drive recovered from a locked drawer in Victor's study contained hours of recorded video, diary-like entries Victor had made. In one dated just a week before his arrest, he spoke directly to the camera. His voice was calm, measured, even pleased. He spoke of Ilara's weakness, her need for discipline, and most chillingly, his fear that she's starting to care about someone else. He mentioned the boy in the woods and how Ilara had been secretly leaving notes. "I'll put an end to it," he said. "She belongs here. She belongs to me." This was the missing piece. Victor had discovered Ilara's brief connection with Callum. Whether it was a friendship, a lifeline, or something more, it had threatened the control Victor had so carefully built. Investigators now believed that Victor had planned to kill Callum, but underestimated Ilara's resolve. The new theory suggested she had tried to warn Callum, perhaps even meet with him, but Victor had followed. What happened next remained unclear, but one thing was now certain: Ilara had acted in fear, possibly in defense, possibly out of desperation. But she had acted. Just as authorities began preparing charges, a hiker discovered skeletal remains, buried in a shallow grave near the river's edge. Dental records confirmed it was Callum Rhodes. The position of the bones and the trauma to the skull suggested he had been struck from behind. Ilara's prints were not found on the improvised weapon, a rusted pipe, but Victor's were. With this new evidence, the narrative shifted again. Ilara had not killed Callum. Victor had. Ilara was officially cleared of all charges and released into a mental health rehabilitation program. She would never return to Hawthorne Hill. Victor Harlow, convicted on multiple counts, would spend the rest of his life in prison. And yet, the town would never forget the horror hidden behind the fences at the edge of the woods, or the girl who, in her silence, had survived it all.